All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here with Alan Collinge. No, Collinge.
Collinge.
Collinge. Right. I just asked you how to pronounce it. And I still fucked it up. Uh, how you doing, man? You are very patriotic today, as you point out. You got a flag behind you. You got a flag on your hat. You buy your hat from the hardware store. You said.
That's right. There was a sale. I don't know if this is a government propaganda thing, but you can get hats with the American flag on it for $2.99 a piece. High quality hats.
Made
So
in
here I
China.
am.
Yeah.
Made in
Yeah.
China, more than likely, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I can remember when having an American flag on any piece of clothing was considered unpatriotic. It was in the late 60s, like people would sew a flag onto their jean jacket or something, and that
Probably
was seen
upside
as,
down, right?
well, I mean, in any way, having a flag as decoration, using it as anything other than a flag was seen as
Right.
desecration. Yeah.
Yeah.
But now it's marketing. Yeah, go America. So, Alan, tell me about the organization that you work with.
Well, I founded Student Loan Justice in 2005. I guess you could say I'm the first activist in the country on the issue of student loans. This is a result of my own personal problems that I noticed with the federal student loan program and their for-profit contractors. So to make a very long story very short, I borrowed about $35,000. Got 3 degrees in aerospace engineering. I was a scientist at Caltech for 3 years after graduation. Prestigious job, but quite low pay. Um, so I left that job. I found myself unemployed for a year or so, and tried in the best of good faith to keep my student loans in good stead. But they meaning Sallie Mae, which is the largest at the time, was the largest and really almost only student loan company in the country. They unceremoniously threw my loans into default. So what began as a $35,000 burden became very quickly a $100,000 demand for payment. And it was somewhere around, and I graduated 1998. So it was somewhere around 2001 or so that I realized something is horribly awry with this loan program. And so I had been working in banking. Interestingly, I shifted from science to banking and government banking, believe it or not. I was running a loan program for the Department of Transportation. So I had learned a fair bit about finance and, good faith and bad faith and what a financial instrument should look like, et cetera. And it just occurred to me that federal student loans had been weaponized. And this is something that no other lender for any other loan can really claim, the strength uniquely of the federal student loan program. The fact that the loans have been stripped uniquely of bankruptcy rights, of statutes of limitations, fair debt collection laws, truth in lending laws, and even state usury laws are not applicable uniquely to federal student loans. So it's really given Wall Street and the banks and these private lending companies a license to steal and abuse. But today, Chris, 20 years later, I can say that probably the chief bad guy on this entire issue is really the Department of Education, who has since taken over the entire lending program, to where the $100 billion in interest that clicks off today on the backs of student loan borrowers across the country, that interest is now going directly to the Department of Education rather than these private banks. Hey,
Really?
I said I'd make this a long story short, but I've made it a little
No,
bit longer than I wanted to.
no.
Basically,
All those details are extremely relevant and important. Don't leave anything out.
yeah, well, I appreciate that. So I started doing some research, and the corruption I found was jaw-dropping. The payoffs to congressmen and their family members, the illegal bribes, and so forth that were going back and forth between the colleges and Sallie Mae. anyways, it was pretty shocking. And in the meantime, my loans of $35,000 were, 110,000, 115,000, interest accruing daily. I took all my research to a really good reporter, and you may actually know her. I don't know, Bethany McLean, who was a writer at Fortune magazine. She had broken open the story about Enron, and so I took my research to her, and it took about a year or so, but she wound up doing a really good, like a 5-page cover story for Fortune that really opened up this can of worms, and that pretty quickly became a top story on 60 Minutes, culminated in a bunch of Senate investigations, New York Attorney General investigations, and it became pretty much the biggest scandal in higher education, certainly, I would say, of this century. And so that was kind of where it began for me. I realized pretty early on that it was the stripping of standard consumer protections that lies at the core of the issue. I had really thought that, Ted Kennedy was the big guy in the Senate who really helped us early on, and it was his investigations that uncovered all the stuff that I just said. I really thought this would be like a 2 or 3 year project, Chris. But lo and behold, here we are 20 years later, and the student loan problem has grown from really terrible proportions to, I would say, catastrophic.
Yeah. So let's step back a little bit. As you've delineated, the student loans are unique in the fact that you cannot declare bankruptcy. Like a business loan, a car loan, a mortgage, every other kind of loan, you can throw up your hands and say, look, I got no money. I need to start over. And your creditors, they can sue you, but if you have no money, there's nothing to take. And the slate is wiped clean. You can start over again. This is always held up as one of the great advantages of American style capitalism, that you can have a business that fails and you can come back and try again. So it encourages risk. But in this one area, this one type of loan, there's no forgiveness. There's no way to get out. You've got it for life. I mean, they can garnish your Social Security payments. Is that correct?
Yes, they can. They can garnish your wages. They can garnish your Social Security. If you're getting disability payments, even they can garnish those, all without a court order. So the federal government and its contractors, they've got collection powers that would really, in the words of Elizabeth Warren, make a mobster envious. Remember, there are also no statutes of limitations, uniquely,
Right.
as far as I know, for student loans. I don't know of any other debt instrument from which statutes of limitations have been removed, but this makes the debt immortal. So they can hound you to the grave. And so it's sort of the 1-2 punch of bankruptcy and statutes of limitations that have really put the teeth into this lending program.
And you said earlier that the money goes to the Department of Education. That surprised me. I thought so. I had student loans, and I got screwed, similar to you. I was in forbearance for a few years, where they're like, okay, you don't have to make payments, but the interest continues to accrue. And then I defaulted. And once you default, all hell breaks loose. So your actual loan amount can double or more. And then they really screwed me because I got a letter saying this is when I went back into payment. I had some money and I was making payments, and they said, why don't you consolidate your loans? That'll make everything much simpler. So, okay, I consolidated the loans into one loan. And then not too long ago, I was reading about this, and I saw that after 20 or 25 years, depending on when the loan was taken out, there's a forgiveness. Like if you're, after 20 years, they say, okay, the hell with it. But what I didn't know is that when I consolidated the loan, that 25-year clock reset.
Yes. That's one of the many, many tricks and traps that are more the rule than the exception for federal student loans. Almost everything, every bit of advice that you may see from, debt coaches and debt lawyers and debt planners and the Department of Education and the lending companies, this is all very bad advice, including signing up for a consolidation loan. And what they promise when they go, oh yeah, sign, it's reasonable payments and 20, 25 years, your debt is canceled. What they don't tell you, and this has been true under both parties' presidents, under Obama, under Trump, the loan cancellations that they promise almost never happen because, like with you, oh, you consolidated. Oh, yeah, you should have known that resets your payment clock to another 20 years. Yeah, these are all sort of harmless omissions that only the benefits of these sort of mistakes always accrue to the lending side, never to the borrowers. And so for income-based repayment, for example, in IBRs, I'm not going to bore you with the alphabet soup of all the different repayment plans, but the disqualification rate for all of the income driven payment plans, it turns out to be something like 99%. So, and the thing that they don't tell you is that the Department of Education and they have no desire, they have no intentions of actually canceling any loans. So we've seen people, and there's a lot of onerous paperwork that goes along with staying in those programs, these annual employment certifications, annual income verification, all this paperwork. So we've had people whose paperwork was disqualified for using the wrong color of ink on their forms. Uh, so there's just a million reasons that they can kick people out of these IDRs. And that's exactly what they do. In 1 year alone, in 2015, and that was under Obama, and I'm a fiercely nonpartisan guy, by the way, kind of can't stand either political party at this point. But in 2015, 57% of the people in the various income payment plans had been booted out just based on one small requirement, which is income verification. So yeah, you don't dot your I, cross your T, maybe even literally, if you use the wrong color of ink. There's a million ways that people can be frustrated out of these groups.
But they
And
hold that up as a sort of, look, we're being reasonable. When you
yes,
take out the loan, don't worry about it. If you're not making a lot of money, your payments are limited to whatever it is, 10% or 15% of your disposable income, you'll be okay. But then when you get to the reality of it, it's a lot more complicated than that.
that's exactly right. They sell these loans to students and their parents. By the way, they're doing loans to parents these days, and they have been for quite some time. They sell these loans. Oh, they're government backed or government held loans. Very friendly, very generous repayment terms. It's basically like a nice soft marshmallow or something. And the fact of the matter is that the exact opposite of that is true. There is no debt instrument in this country more viciously predatory than federal student loans. We've seen cases where the servicers were, and they love defaults, by the way, Chris. They make a ton of money on defaulted loans. I think sounds like from personal experience. I certainly know. Um, but we've found cases where the servicers, the lending companies, they were letting people leave school. They held the loans, or they were contracted to service the loans. They wouldn't call the borrowers. They wouldn't even attempt to contact them, and they would wait for 9 months, and then legally they can throw a loan into default after 9 months of non-payment. And they would throw thousands of people into default. So the loan automatically inflates to gargantuan proportions, and all the collection powers come into play. Uh, and they can essentially ruin somebody's life by doing that. But they see it as a really big money maker because of the inflation of the loans. And honestly, I think a lot of people eventually, maybe they inherit money or they come in to some sort of windfall. So a lot of people, it turns out, ultimately wind up just paying through the nose for, you know, I can tell you many stories. There's a woman, she originally had borrowed $25,000 back in the 90s, I think it was. Today she has repaid over $100,000 back on this $25,000 loan, and she still owes over $100,000. So this is the sort of perpetual debt trap that the federal government, Wall Street, Sallie Mae, Navient, all these, I would say, sociopathic entities have sprung on this country. And I thought I had nailed this problem back in 2006 when I wrote the book and et cetera, and we saw some meaningful congressional action. But I had no idea, Chris, at how deeply ingrained this lending program was. Quite frankly, I didn't really realize how strong not only the Department of Education and these lending companies were, but quite frankly, the colleges also, I have to say, are totally in on this, particularly with regards to what happens in Washington, D.C. with keeping the status quo going.
Yeah. So the incentive structure is confusing to me. There are cases, as you say, where somebody comes into a windfall and, makes a big payment. These financial entities get their inheritance or, when their parents die or something like that. So I can see how it makes sense for them to hold on to these loans and inflate them so they suck up, they vacuum up that windfall. But I imagine that's not that common a case. I mean, that's got to be the minority of the cases. You sent me an article the other day that went through the numbers of defaults and the people who are behind on their payments and people who are just, there's been this several year pause with COVID, people not making payments. And I read recently that now that payments are restarting, a lot of people are just like, nah, fuck it, I'm not paying that, um, it feels, and the statistics, but the article you sent me, you said something like the total amount of outstanding student debt is greater than like the GDP of the country or something. There was it's
Oh,
like the numbers are astronomical.
yeah. So I looked at how much interest the Department of Education was essentially taking from the various states. I think that's probably what you're referring to. So, and I mean, there are some just incredible examples. Like, for example, the Department of Education is taking more interest out of the state of Maine. And Maine, people in Maine, it's not a huge student debt heavy state, it's pretty moderate. But the Department of Education is taking more interest out of the state of Maine than all the lobsters produced in Maine every year. So it's like the biggest industry in Maine is being essentially neutralized by the Department of Education. It's not just Maine, though.
Yeah.
Department of Education takes more interest. And remember, this is just nonsense monopoly money created out of thin air and slapped onto our backs. Um, but it's very real debt to the borrowers, obviously. Department of Education takes more interest out of the state of Florida than its largest employer, Disney World, brings in. So about 6.7 billion in interest every year is taken out of Florida, added to the books of Department of Education, where Disney World only brings in about $5 billion in annual revenue. Um, if you add up
Yeah.
and I could go on and on and on, but I'll just say it's pretty much like that for every state, where the amount of interest the Department of Education is taking out rivals major industries in, agriculture in, the state of North Carolina. All the agricultural exports of that state are exceeded in interest that the Department of Education is taking out of the state. It's, I mean, this is something that the Higher Education Act sponsors, in Congress back in 1965. They've got to be looking down and going, what have
Yeah.
we done here?
Yeah. Yeah. So help me understand this. My understanding is like when I took out student loans, it was through the Bank of America. So the Bank of America lends me the money in this program that's government guaranteed student loan. So if I default on the loan, the government pays the Bank of America off. So they had zero risk, right? The bank has zero risk. And yet they were charging me 8.25% interest, I believe. And the interest at the time on a mortgage or a car loan or, even a personal construction loan was somewhere between 4 and 5%. So they have zero risk. The bank has zero risk, and yet they're collecting an interest rate around double the going rate for anything else where the bank does assume risk of default. And if I default, the government pays them off. Now the government holds my debt, or does the government then sell my debt to a collection agency? How does that work?
It gets even a little more confusing than that, Chris. I'm sorry to tell you, but there's another layer of bureaucrats in this process for the older style loans that you have called guarantors. So there's state guarantors, state of California has a guarantor, New York, New Jersey, etc. And they call themselves guarantors of the loan, and the defaulted loan will go to them, and then they enact collection actions, etc., etc. And then ultimately, if you wind up not paying these middlemen guarantors, then finally the government will then reimburse them. And then the government assumes the defaulted loan, like you're speaking of.
I
So
see.
that's the older style program. It was terrible. It was just a big free for all. There was no risk for the guarantors. There was no risk for the lenders. Um, and even at that time, even the Department of Education was making a modest but not insignificant profit on defaulted student loans. So, I mean, just step back for a minute. A credit card company is thrilled if they get back 10 cents on the dollar on a defaulted credit card account. Well, the
Right.
Department of Education was making back like $1.10, $1.20 on the dollar for these defaulted student loans. So, I mean, this is a defining hallmark of a predatory lending program. I mean, if nobody,
But where are they getting the money? How are they getting the money? If the student throws up their hands and says, "I've got no money, I got no job, I've got no property, I can't pay it." Okay, so then the bank gets paid by the guarantor gets paid by the government, by the Department of Education. But how's the Department of Education? Who's paying them?
well, they have found, and this is true in the past. I don't think it's true going forward, but it has been true in the past that they've essentially found a way to get blood from a stone. When you follow somebody for the rest of their natural lives, pursuing them on this debt, eventually, I mean, a lot of people still won't pay. A lot of people will never pay, and their life will be relegated to second class type citizenship. But apparently, and many years of White House budget data show this going up through 2018, they eventually get their money back plus interest, and this is the federal government here.
Mm.
So the lenders make a king's ransom, the guarantors make huge amounts of money, and even the federal government pretty much can't lose money on this lending program. So these are the sort of perverted financial incentives that, quite frankly, the founding fathers called for uniform bankruptcy rights in the Constitution. If you know anything about like Shays' Rebellion, you'll find that even the reason they wrote the Constitution in the first place was because of unrest in the country, primarily from really angry debtors. Post-Revolutionary War, there was a lot of dirty tricks going on where the lenders were taking advantage of farmers in Western Massachusetts, and yeah, there was rebellion up and down the Eastern Seaboard. So the founding fathers called for uniform bankruptcy laws, aka rights, ahead of the power to declare war, ahead of the power to raise an army, ahead of the power to build a navy in the Constitution, and in fact, ahead of every right in the Bill of Rights. So the founding fathers, I they didn't know about student loans clearly, but I think that they knew the predatory nature of lenders at that time. It was keen on their minds. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson were being treated very poorly by British banks and merchants and friends of the king under debt to England. Uh, Robert Morris spent time in debtor's prison, as did a couple of the other founders. So this really kind of goes to the heart of this country. And I can only think that the founding fathers are looking at this student loan scam, and it is a scam, make no mistake. And they've got to be just shaking their heads saying, this is exactly what we wanted to avoid.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting in a karmic sort of sense because a lot of these tricks have been used by American corporations all around the world. Like they're the typical situation. United Fruit Company comes in, overthrows the government of Guatemala,
Guatemala, yes.
Takes over, says, okay, now we own all this land. People who had been living here for years, we don't recognize your rights. So you can either fuck off or you can work for us. You work for us and our banana plantations. We pay you with United Fruit Company currency that you can only use in United Fruit Company stores where the prices are inflated. Oh, you don't have enough money to feed your family? Well, we'll loan you some money. So now you're in debt to us. The interest of people don't understand what they're signing. So now essentially you're slaves to United Fruit Company for the rest of your life and the life of your descendants. Like this is classic American capitalism, colonialism around the world. We do the same thing with, go into Argentina. The World Bank goes into Argentina and says, oh, you need infrastructure loans. Here's $500 billion. Half of it goes to Swiss bank accounts from, the corrupt government officials taking it for themselves. And the rest of, and now the country is saddled with unpayable debt forever. I mean, this is just classic American capitalism. And it sounds to me that what you're describing is that these techniques that we've used on others have now been turned inward and we're using it on ourselves.
That's exactly right. It's turned in on itself. John Adams famously said, there are two ways to conquer and enslave a country. One is by the sword. The other is by debt. He was talking about foreign expeditions, such as what you mentioned. And there's, don't forget Puerto Rico and Africa, on and on and on. And this is exactly what's happened in this country. They've essentially decided to start eating their own seed corn, if you will. It's really diabolical, and it's nationally threatening, in my humble opinion. The numbers have gotten so large, Chris. When I first started Student Loan Justice, everybody was like, "Who is this?" No, come on now, pay your loans. And that was, I'd go on NPR where I thought I was going to get a friendly audience, but no, 9 out of 10 callers were like, if you borrow money, you got to pay it back. And here today, 2/3 of all student loan borrowers who are out of college, it's actually 3/4 totally, are unable to make payments on their student loans. So even in 2000 and even before the pandemic, the numbers had just fallen off the cliff. So Donald Trump's chief operating officer, Wayne Johnson, who ran the federal lending program, he told me, and he said publicly, that even before the pandemic, 85% of all student loan borrowers were never going to be able to pay off their loans. And so, I'm not a dumb guy, Chris. I've been living and breathing this stuff for 20 years, and I can tell you, this is not an accident. This is, the experts in Washington, D.C., they saw this thing coming from years and decades in the past. But this is planned. This is by design. And
so if it's by design, then doesn't it seem to be self-destructive? Because these people who can't pay their loans, they'll have shitty credit ratings at best. At worst, their wages will be garnished, their Social Security will be garnished. They will not be productive, entrepreneurial, job creating, risk taking members of society. And these are the things that, to my understanding, are what makes America tick as far as an economy goes. They're not going to be, consuming products that are manufactured here. They're not going to be buying new cars and building houses. So when you remove such a huge segment, especially young people, because young people are the ones who consume, right? They're the ones who have kids and buy stuff. And, they're famously older people just put their money away and that becomes capital free for investment. But younger people are the consumption drivers. So if you're essentially not removing them from the economy, but certainly uh, hobbling them in terms of their ability to consume and create, isn't that a self-destructive move for the American economy?
It's absolutely self-destructive. I am at a loss to really explain who's benefiting here. I mean, certainly the Department of Education is making a ton of money. A small group of people in and around Washington D.C., in and around Wall Street, they're making tremendous amount of money on this. But how does it benefit the country? I can't see any upside to this. I
Mm.
suppose there's an element of social control that the people, behind this loan scam. There's maybe something that the colleges obviously love it. Um, but I could maybe point to stuff like the Powell memo, if you're familiar with that. This is Ralph Nader's kind of a hero of mine, a friend of mine as well. But there was an advisor to Richard Nixon, Lewis Powell, who later became a Supreme Court justice. He wrote a memo back in the night shortly before Sallie Mae was formed by Congress. Lewis Powell wrote a memo saying, "Hey, all this stuff we're seeing with women's rights and civil rights and all this stuff in the '60s, we can't have that anymore." And he laid out a 15-point plan or something of how they could prevent the '60s from ever happening again. And it was a very all-encompassing strategy talking about infiltrating and capturing the universities, infiltrating, capturing civil and other civic rights organizations, um, capturing the media, capturing journalism, etc. And it would appear to me, if you read the memo, and it mentioned Ralph Nader by name, is why I mentioned that. Why I mentioned Ralph. They're very worried about guys like Ralph Nader and that whole thing. If you look at what they had hoped to accomplish, and then if you look at the world today, certainly through my very narrow lens of student loan justice, it would appear that they did a bang up job of executing on this plan outlined by Lewis Powell.
Mm.
But I think we've reached the end times as far as the federal student loan program is concerned. The numbers are just, I mean, when you have a default rate of 50, 60, 70%, are we even talking about a viable loan program anymore? I don't think so. I think the federal student loan program, for all intents and purposes, and again, when 2/3 of the people, actually 3/4, are not paying, I mean, what are we even talking about? I've, I've had to really develop a sense of humor around all this. A lot of people in our group, and myself included, we used to take this thing just so seriously. But, the older I get, the more I just kind of have to look at the sky and laugh sometimes. It's just not a legitimate lending program. And yeah, the
Yeah.
power of the lenders still exists. But we're seeing cracks in the foundations everywhere. Like, for example, and the Republicans are just so evil. I have to say, the Democrats are terrible, but the Republicans are just straight up evil on the student loan issue. So Donald Trump takes power, the big beautiful, and he was a train wreck the first 4 years. Um, so he comes back, and they pass this big beautiful bill, which puts even more legal teeth into student loans, makes the loans more expensive, etc. But then when it actually comes time to collect on the loans, the Trump administration, very interestingly, is deciding not to garnish the Social Security of seniors for these loans. And, I live and breathe this stuff, Chris, and wage garnishments were supposed to be starting a couple of months ago in earnest. And I have yet to find even one person who has gotten their wages garnished. So I don't know. I mean, your guess is as good as mine. I
Hmm.
kind of think this thing is so disgustingly terrible and failed, and everybody in Washington knows what I know. You know, they're not idiots. I'm just kind of wondering if maybe they're just kind of trying to tiptoe away from this thing. Uh,
Yeah.
so
Well,
the next,
and isn't Biden, was Biden as a senator, didn't he push the no bankruptcy clause?
he certainly did. You know, even as a junior senator from Delaware in 1976, he was a surprisingly key guy in the very first legislation that started nipping away at the right of bankruptcy for these loans.
Right.
Dennis D. Concini was the sponsor of this bill. He thanked Joe Biden by name when the bill finally passed. So yeah, Biden knows all about the federal student loan scam. He was probably the leading elected official pushing the removal of bankruptcy rights from private student loans in 2005. But he's been there fighting for the lenders the whole way through.
Yeah. Well, being from Delaware, I guess that's the big credit card debt
That's
bank kind of capital.
that's how that
Now,
goes.
let's step back a little bit. So, what do you say to those 9 out of 10 callers on NPR who raise the point of, well, you signed that paper, that's your word, and that, the sort of honoring your word is what makes the world go round. And if we just forgive all these debts, you've got the moral hazard argument. And then you also have it's not fair because then everyone else is essentially paying, people who didn't go to college are now paying the debt of the people who did go to college. Like, what's your response to those arguments?
Yeah, you've just repeated probably the biggest two or three lies, literally falsehoods that are promoted in the zeitgeist around student loans. So first of all, when student loans were created in 1965, President Lyndon Johnson, he declared that the loans would be free of interest. Free of interest. And that, makes sense. Why should the government make a profit on these loans? Well, many years of data, and today, of course, the government is accruing something like 100, 105, 110 billion dollars a year in interest. But if you look at many years of budget data, Department of Education annual financial reports, you'll see that the Department of Education has been getting back money from the borrowers roughly almost on a par with what they've been lending out. So the most recent credible data that we can look at is before the pandemic. 2019, the Department of Education was lending out around $85 billion, maybe actually $90 billion. They were getting back something like $85 billion in payments from the borrowers. So of that gargantuan number, that $1.7 trillion in outstanding student loan debt, for all intents and purposes, it's basically profit. It's
Mm.
profit over and above the amount that was originally borrowed. So
Right. So
anytime
if you just stopped right now, essentially, if everyone just stopped paying right now, essentially the lenders got their money back.
exactly. The lenders, which is today the federal government. So I forgot to mention, since you and I were in college, the lending system has changed to where Obama federalized the lending program. Probably a good move. Uh, Instead of private banks being in the mix as lenders, the federal government is now the lender. They make the loans. They make the interest on
Uh,
the loans. The old big student loan companies are still around. They're still parasiting off of the system as servicers and also as collection companies that pursue defaulted borrowers. But the government is the lender now. So yeah, of that $1.7 trillion outstanding, the vast majority of it is profit. So anytime somebody says that the federal government is repaying people's student loans, it's just false. When they say, "Oh, canceling student loans will be a cost to the taxpayer," That's really a lie. It's essentially accounting fraud.
Yeah,
So I
good
try and
point.
keep it simple for people, and I say, if you buy a lottery ticket, a little scratcher lottery ticket, and you don't win the $1,000,000 that you were hoping for, but you do win like the $1 booby prize, so you kind of get your money back. Um, did you lose money on that lottery ticket? Most people would say no. I broke even.
Right,
And
right.
I'm saying, well, our opponents, the people fighting for this federal student loan scam, they're claiming that lottery ticket was actually a loser. It actually cost them $1,000,000 because they didn't win the $1,000,000. And I'm like, try that on your taxes, buddy. Try to write off your losing lottery ticket next year for a
Yeah,
$1,000,000 loss, and you will go to prison.
yeah.
So it's a lie. And, I don't want to talk too much about deep state stuff, but it's really interesting, Chris. The people that perpetuated that specific lie was these two guys, these two academics, one from the University of Utah, Adam Looney, and another from Penn State, the Wharton School, Kent Smetters. These are two Harvard PhD economists. They both wrote these articles saying that canceling student loans would cost the taxpayers just ridiculous sums. They both also worked for years at the Treasury Department, at the US Treasury. And so, sort of connecting the dots. And I've seen the Treasury Department do some pretty interesting things beyond this as well. But you just have to really question, what exactly is going on behind the veil in Washington, D.C. Clearly, the Treasury Department is involved in perpetuating this loan scam. Clearly, the Federal Reserve, believe it or not, is pulling some strings behind the scenes to perpetuate this loan scam. They've been micromanaging um, truth in lending laws for private student loans. Like, the Federal Reserve is supposed to be doing only two things, right? Controlling inflation and fighting for maximum job attainment. Well, I can prove to you, it's a matter of record, that the Federal Reserve was micromanaging something called Regulation Z, which is part of the truth in lending laws. And uniquely for student loans, the Federal Reserve has been issuing very predatory guidance to the private student loan companies, saying, oh, you don't have to tell them about what the APR is. You can only just tell them about the interest rate. So that way you might have a 6% interest loan that actually has a 24% APR, and you can more easily foist them onto the borrowers. So, I'm just like, why the fuck is the Federal Reserve so interested in keeping this catastrophically failed loan scam going? It just makes no sense to me.
Is it, it's starting to sound like, with so many things with government, there's like tangible reality, and then there's the narrative. And those things seem to be veering ever further apart from one another. The tangible reality of this situation seems to be that they've drained as much blood as they can possibly drain from everybody, 40 and under who went to college. They're just who got student loans. They've set it up so lopsidedly against the borrower that they're just sucking as much. It's almost like the parasite doesn't want to suck too much energy out of the host because it kills the host, right? And it feels like that's the point we're at. But the narrative, the accounting, the numbers on the books, all this money owed to the government is on the asset side of the books, right? So there are trillions of dollars of student loan debt that's owed to the government that's on the positive side of the books for the government.
Yes.
To wipe that off the books might just throw the whole thing spinning out of control. right? I mean, the federal government accounting is all fictional anyway, but
Yes.
like you've got to keep it believable, or interest rates go crazy, people stop investing in the United States, and the whole thing falls apart.
I think that's a big part of it. In fact, our some of our main opposition comes from people who are budget experts, like the Center for a Responsible Budget, and um, and many others. Uh, it's true. But reality is a real bitch. If you don't deal with reality sooner and you wait until later, then reality really tends to kick you even harder later. And I can tell you that of the 1.7 trillion that they have sitting on their books, it's at this point, I think the pandemic was the nail in the coffin. I think it's probably 80% garbage paper. They'll never get it.
Right, right.
So whether by the natural death of the borrowers because they spent their lives trapped under these fucking poisonous loans, pardon my French, uh, or through any other means, the debt absolutely will be canceled. And you can have any opinion you might want to have about that fact, but it is a fact, and there's nothing that I or you or anybody could do or say to make that not true. We're talking
Yeah.
about phantom garbage paper, and in my humble opinion, the quicker they can deal with this and quite frankly end and replace this loan scam with something rational and reasonable, the better. Because people are starting to kill themselves about this. Particularly younger people who maybe haven't learned to accept all the bullshit that comes with the world and all the bullshit that's out there that I can tell you're very aware of. People. There was a guy in Pennsylvania about a year ago. He sued the Department of Education over his student loans. Um, Lost predictably, and the kid just snapped. He lost his mind. He declared war on the federal government. He murdered his own father, who was a federal pensioner. And it was just the most disgusting thing that you can imagine. A family in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. They filed for bankruptcy, thinking that they were going to be able to expunge their student loan debt. It's a family of I think two mother and a father and 6 kids. They filed for bankruptcy. They found out the hard way that student loans are uniquely non-dischargeable in bankruptcy. So this is a Southern family. So they got all the shame of a bankruptcy and obviously none of the relief. And the mother and the father killed the kids, killed themselves, and set the house on fire. And, I don't like to be too morose, but I could probably talk for an hour or so about all the suicides and other things that we've documented over the past couple decades, but they've gotten way worse over the past just 2 years. So we're seeing a real increase in just horrible, horrible outcomes, and I would say they're absolutely directly related to this student loan problem.
Historically, there's debt jubilee has been declared by kings and emperors, right? And it seems that that's sort of a natural part of the life cycle of debt. You sort of run it up, you use it to manipulate the peons and the peasantry. And when it gets to the point where they can't pay it anymore, you win popular acclaim by saying, we're going to forgive this debt that you can no longer pay anyhow because
Yes.
we recognize that we're never getting that money back, but at least we can get a bunch of adulation and popularity and ass kissing out of this. Do you think maybe that's where we are? Is that what it seemed like? That's what Biden tried to do, and the Republicans stopped him.
Well, I don't think Joe Biden was very serious about canceling loans, quite frankly. I think the Delaware senator in him will never change. I think he was very disingenuous with that effort. I think
So you
people
think
like
that was just to appeal to people like, hey, I'm trying,
exactly. It was
but
all for
not
show.
really.
If you look at
Uh,
people like Nancy Pelosi and Susan Rice, other very influential sort of power broking Democrats, they were absolutely opposed to this loan cancellation. But yes, the Jubilee 2025 was decreed a Jubilee year by Pope Francis before he died. A lot of people don't know that, but indeed, 2025. So it depends on sort of what tradition you follow, but Jubilee is a very real thing. And even, Adam Smith in Wealth of Nations, he said, the financial relationships between countries are characterized by a few things, but one of those things was pretend payments. So, and I think that we've seen that even in our lifetimes. I'm very suspicious that, for example, in around 2006 or 7, Mexico owed us like $5 billion. And it was made big news and there was some kerfuffle about it. And then about like maybe not even a year later, about 7 months later, they're like, oh, by the way, Mexico paid us. They don't say how they paid us or what happened. That was a lot of money back then, 5 billion.
Yeah.
But I have to
And
wonder if
El
maybe
Chapo showed up in Texas.
right, yeah, maybe they laundered some drug money. Who knows? But yeah, I just have to wonder at what point. I can tell you that the student loan problem is essentially fantasy at this point. The $1.7 trillion is just monopoly money, and at this point, it's just cruelty. And shame on the Republicans. They're just so vicious and cruel. But I also have to say shame on the Democrats for their insincerity. The Democrats had been promising for many years, since 2005, they'd been promising to return bankruptcy protections to these loans, it's the heart of the whole thing. It's the fulcrum upon which this whole thing rests. And so for years and years, we pushed and we fighted and we waited, and we got a good bankruptcy bill in 2018 from Dick Durbin. And then and then the Democrats won power in 2020, House, Senate, presidency. Dick Durbin, really good guy out of Illinois, had a great bill, a bankruptcy bill. It had bipartisan support, so people like Josh Hawley, John Cornyn, Republican senators, they were co-sponsored on the bill. The bill was perfectly poised to pass. Dick Durbin had all the support that he needed. And at the very 11th hour, the colleges lobbied against us. And this is according to Dick Durbin's office. And so after many, many years, the Democrats finally had a chance to prove that they were serious about fighting for student loan borrowers. And they just pulled the rug out from under us in the most painful, most frustrating way. So we're, as I said, a fiercely nonpartisan group. In my humble opinion, both parties have abandoned and betrayed us, and looking pretty bleak going forward. But I try and keep my sense of humor about things.
So what does student loan justice do primarily? Are you primarily interacting with elected representatives trying to change the legislation, or are you advising borrowers, or what do you guys do?
We're fighting for the return of bankruptcy protections. We were fighting. In fact, our group started the petition at change.org/cancel student loans. Ignited the entire topic of canceling student loans by executive order in 2020. So before Elizabeth Warren or Chuck Schumer, anybody was talking about it, we put out the idea of canceling student loans by executive order, which is a very sexy concept. The petition grew to over 1 million signatures, caught fire. Elizabeth Warren, Chuck Schumer embraced it, and then unfortunately it became a political issue. So we've been fighting for student loan cancellation since 2020, but by and large, we fight for the return of bankruptcy rights. And at this point, we don't care what politicians we have to talk to. We talk to both sides. So right now, we are pushing the Republicans incredibly hard. We're seeing some good things from conservatives. We're seeing some very hopeful comments from people like Jerome Powell, who in the Senate about a month ago he essentially called in the way that he does, very in a very mild way. So, I really have to question the wisdom of why student loans are non-dischargeable in bankruptcy. But people like Joe Rogan and Matt Taibbi, if you know who that is, a lot of influencers. Sure. People like David Sachs, the crypto czar for President Trump this year, they've all called recently for the return of bankruptcy protections to student loans. And so I'm guardedly hopeful, but that's what we do. We talk to Congress, we write articles, we just try and get the truth about student loans out there, and it's just buried in an avalanche of, pardon my French, bullshit out there. The propaganda versus actual good information ratio is like 9-1 or something like that. The
Right.
entire media, and I think you know this far better than I do, Chris, the entire state of journalism has just nosedived since, like, I would say 2008 or 9. So it's very hard to get reporters to report even basic facts about student loans anymore. Just one example: older people now outnumber younger people. So people over the age of 35 now outnumber the people under the age of 35 with student loans by a pretty wide margin, a couple, 3 million people. And the older crowd owes on average way more than the younger crowd. So the face
Sure.
of the student loan problem, it's not this 20 something blue haired latte sipping nose ring liberal
Right.
that's with their panties in a bunch. No, no, no. This is an older person's problem now today, more than a younger person's problem. Very easily verified through nothing more than Department of Education data. New York Times won't report that headline. Wall Street Journal, none of the main CNN, none, and I work with all those guys. None of these people will report that very simple headline. NPR, no. It's very newsworthy, very interesting, very significant, but yet nobody will report the headline. And so is it too, like across the spectrum with many, many other issues um, surrounding student loans. Mainstream media, mainstream journalists, they just won't touch it anymore. They've been captured. Yeah, you saw what happened in the shakeout after 2008. I would say after Occupy Wall Street as well. Uh, Journalism has almost totally gone away, certainly from the major broadcasting networks. Pretty hard to find the truth anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think the only, way to do it is to talk to somebody like you who has spent decades researching this and, you know, isn't being paid off by a bank or the government or someone else.
Yeah, that's true. The corruptions are everywhere. Yeah, I didn't realize I was taking a vow of poverty when I decided to take this project on in my mid 30s back in 2006. But here I am now in my mid 50s, and
Yeah.
my ethics are important. But I wonder how much longer I can do this. You know, I survive and thrive on very very modest support, maybe $3,000 a month or so in personal gifts. But I will not do deals with the bad guys. The truth is, it's important enough to me to not do deals with any bad guys, anybody. We just won't do that.
Right.
But the truth is a very scarce thing when so many other people are being paid to obfuscate the truth. It's
Yeah.
a pretty tough battle.
Well, there does seem to be an inverse relationship between how meaningful your work is and how well compensated it is in this world.
You
It's a
know,
strange world.
I don't get it, Chris. I wake up and I'm kind of like you. I'm a vagabond. I've lived in many vans for many years, and I've worked in Alaska. I've done all that stuff. I can survive on very little. I've lived like a graduate student my whole entire life. Um, but what's going on? I feel like I wake up every day and I'm like, what's the most useful thing I can do? And it's the student loan justice thing. And so why is it the most useful things are often the least well compensated?
Yeah.
I don't get it. Money just flows towards the other side for some reason. I guess maybe money is evil or something.
Well, talk to a nurse or a kindergarten teacher or a home health care worker. These are
Yeah,
people who are, essential to other people's lives and they're getting paid shit.
to talk to a cook in a restaurant. I've cooked in many restaurants for many years. It's probably the profession I'm best at. Cooks are paid garbage, even compared to waitresses. They often don't share the tips, and they're just paid just a grunge wage for super difficult work.
Yeah.
It's just completely ass backwards.
Well, dude, we're lucky to have you. You've got a brain that gets you into Caltech, and you've turned it to helping people who are getting screwed and don't really have anyone in their corner. So I really admire that. And I hope when you're looking at your graduate school life and you're feeling bad, I hope you remember that you're one of the good guys, and
Well, thanks, man.
you're doing meaningful work for
I
sure.
appreciate that greatly. That's my sustenance. Hearing great comments like that from you, I really appreciate it. I really appreciate your podcast, by the way. I don't know that much about it, but just in the research I've done over the past couple days, you interviewed Rick Beato. That's the coolest thing in the world to me. I love Rick Beato.
Yeah.
I like your whole take on things, and I really think that it's channels exactly like yours that are gonna save us from a very dark place.
Well, or at least entertain us while we're in the dark place.
That's true. We can
That's all.
play the
Uh,
fiddle while Rome burns or something.
exactly. Exactly. Listen, people who want to support your work, how do they do that?
Oh, it's just studentloanjustice.org. Pretty easy to find.
Okay. And there's a donation button, I imagine, or
Yeah,
something
there's all
like
that
that.
stuff. Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. Thank you, Alan.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. It's been a real pleasure.